Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's Thursday morning, so hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in. So let's jump in and see what we got. First up on Patreon, Stephen Faust wanted to follow up on the discussion from last week about having phase issues with their Genesis 2 and some cables. And they said that they actually had two kind of newer retro gaming cables versions of the Genesis 2 cable. So they've contacted Insurrection Industries to see if they can get one of theirs and see if that solves the phase issue, which is something I'd be really interested to see because I didn't run into that problem, but I also wasn't really looking for it. I kind of just went in, and if I didn't notice any phase issues, I wouldn't have said anything. But I'm not sure if I ever did in-depth testing with every different type of cable and a triple bypass Genesis 2 and all versions of the tank. I would think I would have stumbled across it, but who knows? Everybody makes mistakes, and or maybe I did do it and I just totally forgot. I do so many different testings, and my memory is pretty solid for an old man like me who does all of these different things, but sometimes I just, especially if it's a really busy week and lack of sleep, a lot of stress, it's just gone forever and I don't even remember I did it. So yeah, keep us posted, let us know. And you did mention something that you didn't say anything bad. I just wanted to explain for anybody else who's listening who might be curious. You said you would go down the route of HD Retrovision cables, but they're twice the price of other SCART cables. So they'd like to exhaust other solutions first. So I totally understand. And what you said is correct. I just want to make sure people know that this is one of those scenarios in which that's just what it costs to make these, because it's got some circuitry inside, really shielded cables, like very, very well shielded cables and high quality control. So that's what you're paying for. So they are very expensive, but they're not overpriced. However, the farther away you get from the main distribution, the more you have to pay in import taxes and shipping and all of that. So not wanting to spend the money on those is perfectly reasonable. I always like to remind people when the scenarios are, this is just how much it costs, and when you might actually be getting overcharged. And it's surprising to me how often people confuse the two. Once again, not you, Stephen, just for everybody else listening, I kind of wanted to use your follow-up as just an excuse to discuss that part as well. Another follow-up from last week, Tony Escobar double-checked and did update the EverDrive N8 firmware the correct way and was able to also test on their Tiny NES, and it worked perfectly. So this seems to be an issue with the latest firmware and the Analogue NT Mini FPGA-based console, which is pretty interesting. So hopefully Crix is aware of this and could possibly even reach out to Analogue and see what's going on. However, you can just downgrade the firmware on your EverDrive. So if anybody else runs into this issue, that's a temporary solution. But can anybody else chime in and say if you have an EverDrive N8 Pro and you're using it on an Analogue NT Mini, are you getting the same issues? Is it working? Is it sometimes not loading games? It would be interesting to see if this is a problem tied to one specific thing, or maybe it is just an issue with the firmware, but it would be awesome if anybody else here could help. And you could always try posting on Crix's forums as well. Crix does read through those posts, so if there is an issue, you might be able to just find it there and see if there's a solution. Next up, Carl Goscher said they've made it a resolution this year to finally recap all of their remaining retro consoles and displays. They have some experience recapping consoles, and they've already ordered some recap kits from Console 5, so they're pretty much ready to go. The only question they have is about power supplies. How necessary is it really that they recap a nearly 20-year-old console's PSU before it stops working? Is this something they can continue procrastinating on, or is it possible a PSU failing from old capacitors could damage their consoles? Well, first of all, definitely do it, especially if you're talking about internal power supplies. I'm not sure I've seen a scenario in which internal PSUs will fail and kill the console, but it's absolutely not impossible. And they're a giant source of heat, and anytime you have a lot of heat next to capacitors, that's one way to prematurely age them. So without a shadow of a doubt, if you're talking about internal PSUs, yes, recap those as well, just to have it done. I'm not sure I would do it on like a Nintendo Switch, a 5-year-old console, but anything that's previous generation or before, if you decide that you want to do a recap, it's definitely include the power supplies. And the older the console, the more important that is, obviously. There are certain scenarios that you might run into, like external PSUs. The Sega Genesis power brick, I think, has one screw, and you could pretty easily take it apart and replace that capacitor, whereas a Super Nintendo power supply, I've never been able to get the power brick open. I didn't try very hard, to be honest with you, but a couple of friends of mine said it was a giant pain, so I think I tried with like a flat-edged tip to try to get it open, and just said, you know what, I'm going to go spend like 15 bucks on a Triad power supply and not worry about this anymore. So that's the only scenarios in which I might just say, I don't know if this is worth it to me. But even then, I'm addressing the problem in a different way. So that's going to be up to you. But yeah, absolutely recap the PSUs as well. And depending on the scenario, you might actually need to do that before the rest of the console. So it's definitely something to look into, but Console 5 should have cap kits for that as well. Next up, Perkin Warbeck said they've recently started shopping for a new monitor for their game room for HD content. Their plan for this monitor is to have a PS3, Xbox 360, PS5, and Switch all hooked up. They're looking for something about 27 inches. Initially, they thought they wanted a 4K monitor so the 1080p content from the Switch, PS3, or 360 could get a clean 4x upscale, but they're wondering if a 1440p monitor might do okay for this content. They'll be sitting just a few feet from it in a desk-like configuration. There's just a lot more options at 1440p, and they worry they're ruling them out too quickly. So this is an interesting question and not something I'm a total expert on, but I do have quite a bit of insight. First of all, how does 1080p content scale into a 1440p versus a 4K display would definitely depend on not only the chipset that the monitor has, which does the scaling, but also the settings and a whole bunch of other factors. And I'm actually really curious about that for certain stuff. However, remember that none of these monitors do integer-based nearest neighbor scaling. So it's possible that the scaling method they use might look better for 1080p stuff in 4K, or it's possible that it's going to be not perfect in either way and not really matter. What I would suggest is, what is your budget and what other stuff are you going to connect to it? Because if you have a monitor that's a higher refresh rate, you could certainly play PS5 at 1440p 120, that type of stuff. I think there was some kind of issue with that, so PS5 owners chime in if I'm getting that one wrong, but the higher refresh rate stuff is a big deal. And once you start to get past a certain resolution, I think that's far more important than the resolution. But you might not be able to access it all at all. So if you're not going to be using BFI with a RetroTinked 4K Pro or something like that, then it might not be too much of an issue for you. And you would get a tiny bit more latency for 60 hertz content if you got like a 240 hertz 1440p monitor. It's not a ton more, but it is more. So I would really just take a look at budget for this, as well as, what are the other things you're going to use it for and what other equipment do you have? If you said you had a RetroTink 4K Pro, I would say look into getting a 1440p OLED monitor so that you could do a lot of BFI stuff, so you could get smooth motion even with PS3, 360, PS5, Switch. Not PS5 is not going to go through the Tink 4K Pro, but the other ones might, depending on which input resolutions, what output you're going to set it to. Whereas if you're like, no, I just want to connect these consoles to a monitor, maybe just getting a 1440p 60 monitor would be cheaper and better for your budget. But those are just my opinions, and those are kind of where I'm at right now, thinking about what is the next monitor I should get for the testing that I do. But if anybody has any thoughts, especially if you think I got that wrong, please chime in. I just am kind of approaching this from a perspective of somebody that does more testing than gaming. So, just remember, RetroRGB is what I do. So it's definitely something that I always run into. But as far as just plugging in and playing, I don't think you're going to go wrong with basically any monitor. Just check your budget, check the features, and see what you could get. And unless you're using it for, regular computery stuff where you have your taskbar up all the time, I would look into OLEDs because you can get them much cheaper than they used to be, and the motion blur on those is, especially if you have any way to do BFI, is noticeably better. So just my opinions, but I'm certainly interested in reading the comments and seeing what you all think. Next up are a couple of questions from Dark Roast Chris. First, any idea if anyone's going to start selling the components for the Open MVS again? Both TiTalk and Retro Gamer Stuff are no longer selling them, and they can't seem to find anyone else selling the components. So that's certainly open for anybody to produce themselves, hence the open source Open MVS. However, I thought TiTalk was going to be making other batches, so you might want to reach out and double check. But if not, we really need a company to step up and do this. But sorry to be a downer here, but one of the main reasons why companies aren't doing that is because of dirty cloners. Now, every time I talk about this stuff, I just get a barrage of comments from people who don't understand what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's my fault. I don't want to retell the whole story and waste everybody's time who does know, but other time they just don't listen and they just want to mouth off. So it's really hard to get the point across. But if you have a company that is a known thief stealing from people in the retro scene, and then they go and make an open source project, that is not stealing, but you're still giving them your money, which they're going to use to go steal other people's products. I don't understand how people can't understand that. I get into arguments in the comments all the time, and it's very frustrating how people just don't see that. Also, when you have scumbag companies making really low quality stuff, and they pick up an open source project and make it with the lowest quality components with no quality checking and just dump them on the market, two things happen. A couple of things, but two really negative things happen. First, a lot of them fail, and then whatever project that is starts to get a bad reputation. But then also, companies who take the time to make really good products that do the quality checks and use the high quality components, they have to obviously charge more. So now people go, oh, you're just ripping us off. You're charging too much. And they don't end up selling them. So everybody loses when we support clone companies, even if they're not cloning, and this is one of the things that you see. This is people not making open source stuff like this is a direct result of crappy clone companies undercutting people and selling the prices too cheap. So if that's not clear, let me know, but I have a hard time trying to make it any clearer than that. So, and by the way, Dark Roast, I'm not coming at you, Chris. I just want to explain this for everybody else listening. Next, if money was not a factor, what HDMI switch or matrix would I personally buy? They're looking for one with a minimum of 4 inputs and 4 outputs and would rather buy once and cry once than mess with lower end switches trying to find something that works. So I don't know. And my personal approach to this is, while yes, I would like high-end nice things if I had the money to buy them, but my job is to get people the right product for what they need. And your average retro gamer and modern gamer as well are willing to invest in a good TV, and they're willing to invest in a good processor like the TINC 4K Pro. But where else are they going to spend their money? You know, you buy a 77-inch OLED and a TINC 4K Pro, and now you have all your consoles hooked up to it, and you need to get some switches. You don't have the budget left for a $2,000 switch. And if you did, wouldn't you rather spend that money on a $2,000 AVR so you could just start your amazing home theater setup or something like that? So I always try to find things that are mid to low end when it comes to the accessories like that. Now, that said, if there was ever one HDMI switch that really truly did everything all of us needed and was perfect in every way, sure, I would absolutely look into it and do a video on it. I'm not adverse to doing a video on a $1,200 HDMI switch, but it's not something that's going to benefit me, most of my audience, and most of the people who are looking to piece this stuff together. So my short answer to you is I have no clue, because I stop looking once the price goes over $500. And I don't know if I personally would spend $500 on one unless it really truly had every single feature that I needed. You know, dedicated audio extraction channel, different CEC controls, ways to move CEC controls between inputs like you would everything else. I mean, it would have to be really, really in depth for me to start dropping that much money on it. And I'm pretty sure that exists over $1,000. So, both of your questions, I have really lousy answers for you. I'm sorry, Chris. I'm just honest. I always try to be honest, whether it's a depressing answer or not. Also, Chris said they look forward to these supporter Q&As every week. So thank you for continuing to do them for all these years, and they're proud to be a supporter. Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate that. And I hope my negative answers don't turn you off in that opinion. But, I'd rather have people annoyed with me and be honest than try to just fluff things up. But hopefully next week I'll be able to give you better answers. Next up, Danny Funker said they have a Sony Trinitron CRT about 28 inches. It weighs a whole lot, and they were wondering about getting a TV stand for it. What should they watch out for? Do they need to get one from a thrift store, or could they get something new? They know I'm passionate about these CRTs, so they wanted my input. So my personal opinion on this is that I like a rolling cart with a very high-end caster on it. Now, that's just my opinion. A lot of people are going to say, why do I want a metal-looking thing, even though they're black and silver and you can get different colors of them? A lot of people look at that and go, that looks like it should be in an office somewhere, not in my home. But I like it because now I could have either just a monitor or a monitor and the consoles that I want paired with it on a cart with some good casters, so I could just wheel it in front of my couch whenever I'm ready to play it, or just wheel it back when I'm done. I did a whole video on that. I'll link in the description, which is both kind of silly, but I'm also serious about that. The only things that I will reiterate again is you can get knockoff racks, but do not get the screw-in knockoff casters. You have to get the ones that you hammer in. I get the ones from Global Industrial, and actually, hold on, I think I have one right here. So my old cart that my D32 used to be on, if you're watching this on video here, you could kind of see that the screw is bent completely and about to fall out. And I'm sorry for repeating myself. I've told the story 1,000 times, but I came home one day and my buddy John, who used to own a chicken restaurant, said, hey, you really shouldn't be using those knockoff casters. We use all of these at the restaurant and you got to get the real ones to support all that weight. So I ordered the same ones that I showed in the video that I linked to in that as well. And I got it home and I built it up, and Beast was supposed to come over after work that day to help me move the D32 over. And I'm looking and I'm going, because I'm trying to match the shelves to the same height because I had it measured so it would be perfect eye level when I'm sitting on my couch. I'm going, why aren't the shelves matching up? Did I put it at a different angle or something? And that's when I realized the wheel had completely bent off and it was about to snap under the pressure. So 1 or 2 more turns and it either would have backed itself out and fallen out or snapped, and the D32 would have gone on its glass front and smashed. So I got like that, mom strength and was just, and picked it up myself and slapped it on there, which it wasn't too bad. It wasn't the heaviest thing I ever lifted, but that was very heavy and that scared me. So I never did that again. And the reason I have this here is because I then repurposed that rack for just basic stuff, like papers, empty boxes, like I have like a shipping station, and I'm now taking that rack and repurposing it for a Panasonic Tau widescreen. And I took the rack apart and I'm using all of the same components. I gotta actually cut this one off with a grinding wheel or something, and then I just popped the rubber off of the top, and that's where I'm going to be hammering in the casters. Hopefully they'll still fit in this. So that was my way of being cheap and just using the same rack but swapping out the wheels. So that was a really long description of what I do, but I just wanted to paint the picture of why I would use something like that rather than another stand, because there's so much flexibility about it. And I even have just monitors on some, so I could just wheel the monitor, but then I have the full station. So if it's the consoles that I would only want to use on this one monitor anyway, like I would only want to use a Dreamcast on a CRT that supports 480p. I would only want to use the Wii on a widescreen 480p CRT that like the Panasonic Tau. So that's just kind of stuff that's my preference. To answer your actual question though, all of the new stuff that's out there is only designed for very, very light TVs. And even a heavy, quote unquote, heavy 77-inch OLED is not even remotely close to as heavy as CRTs would have been, especially when you get over 27 inches. So if I were you and you said, no, I want this to look vintage, I don't want it to look like it's in a stupid office like Bob has, I would go to a thrift shop and look for old CRT stands. And the other thing too is don't twist them. So that was one thing that my dad and I used to mention a lot when we would go to like bargain stores to get our TV stands. Place them straight down very carefully, but don't try to twist or slide them. Put it straight down and you should be fine. But the older ones, as long as you don't twerk it so that you might bend the wood in there and cause it to break, you should be fine, especially if they were all designed to have CRTs on them. But it's funny, a lot of IKEA furniture says right in the manual, do not put a CRT on it, which is kind of funny because I bet you there's a bunch of 20-year-old college kids going, why would we put critical race theory on top of a TV stand? So yeah, whatever. But so that's what I would suggest. Look into the racks just in case, but if not, try the older ones. And if anybody has any new furniture that they use, I'd certainly be open to checking out what they look like and, helping spread the word. Next question, they also have a Mister and an NES, which they have used a few times, but since there's no stand, they haven't put much time on it. Yeah, so that's the other thing I do like about the racks is I always have one extra shelf in there. So there's the bottom shelf, there's the shelf that you should aim so that wherever you're sitting is at eye level, and that's where you put the CRT. And then almost always I have a third one in there, even though it only allows for, one normal height and then one kind of shorter, but NES and Mister are perfect examples because on that bottom shelf, you just need it high enough so that you could flip the flap of the NES open, and most of the Misters aren't very tall anyway, so that should fit. But that's up to you. You could totally do it with just 2 racks and have a lot of room, but I'll leave a link to that video and stop rambling about something I already spent a lot of time doing a fancy video about. But good question. Next up, Bill Olson just had an update about the models for 3D printing a Genesis 3 case that I mentioned in Q&A 330. They had issues printing the stands, but Retro Game Revival released updated models on printables, and they work well so far. They've only printed the power switch and reset switch on their Ender 3. They also have a shared project on PCBWay, and they'll share the links for anyone else interested. So I will put both of those links in the description. Thank you very much for updating us on all of that, and also thank you very much for sharing the links. This is one of those things that, not everybody with the Genesis 3 is going to need it, but if they do, they're all cheering, thanking you right now. So thank you very much. Next up, Cam wanted to follow up regarding longer than typical cables for RGB, component, etc. There's a company called Blue Jeans Cables that's well known in audiophile circles for high-quality, custom-built cables. They also offer high-quality custom video cable, including RGB, component, composite, S-video, etc. They don't list SCART as a connector option on their site, but they bet if they knew there was interest from the retro gaming community in their products, they would change that. I should check them out. So I've heard of them before, and they're not cheap, but they're also not stupidly priced. I think when you get into the audiophile world, you get into that $20,000 power cable, scenario, which is, don't ever fall for that crap, please. But there is absolutely there is a fair price to pay for really high quality cables. And I think Blue Jeans Cable kind of nails that price point. Something's really important to you, or something is going to cost a lot if you ever have to replace it. Like when we've been talking about putting cables in walls. If people said, I'm just going to run it underneath my heater and go around, there's a lot of really cheap options. But if you're cutting your wall open to remodel, or if you're building it from scratch, think of this as a cost of the build. And that way you never have to replace the cable. So I completely agree. This is probably the scenario for that, and I'll link to the cables anyway down there just to have. Also, though, as far as SCART connector as an option on their site, that I'm not really sure they would be willing to do because, first of all, they're not doing anything custom that requires components in the cables because not only is that not their business, but then they start getting into safety issues, etc. If you're just talking about SCART connectors on both sides, there's still the whole in versus out thing to worry about, which is a massive pain unless you're really used to it. But also there's a lot of conductors inside a SCART cable. So I could imagine a scenario, and now I'm guessing, I've never talked to this company before, I don't know them at all, I'm making things up right now, but if I were the person in charge of making custom cables at Blue Jeans Cable, I would say, I don't want to deal with SCART. Why don't you get yourself some nice shielded left and right audio cables? And then why don't you just break out the other signals that you need? You need RGBS. Why don't we just get you 4 shielded cables and make yourself some connectors on each end? That is definitely my answer to that, but who knows? Maybe they'll give it a try. Just remember, though, that's at least 6 cables then you would need in there. And that's not even including if you need to route power, how they're going to handle the grounding. So that's going to be a very, very thick cable if they make everything shielded like that. So I'm very happy that you reminded me about the company, and I'm happy to share the link to it. I just wanted to put some expectations in check about how different SCART is from every other type of cable out there. So I just don't want to, I don't want people to just bomb Blue Jeans Cable with emails thinking they're going to get new SCART cables, where I don't think that's realistically possible. But who knows? Hey, maybe if they're outside of the US, or if they have a different office outside of the US, they already deal with that. But we'll see. Either way, I'll leave the link in the description for people. Now over on Floatplane, Dumez has a couple of questions. First, they have a RetroTink 4K Pro setup, and they also have a G-Comp switch, but that's full, and they want to add a Dreamcast to the setup as well. And they also want to make sure they have a solution that supports both the 15 and 31 kilohertz games. So basically, 480p is what most of the games are supported or on the Dreamcast support, but some will only run in 480i or 240p without patching the games. I think there's still maybe one left that you need a patch for or something like that. So my suggestion would then be to get one of the RGB SCART cables that has a switch built into it. And I would always leave it in 31 kilohertz mode, 480p, until you run into a game that doesn't work. Then power off your Dreamcast, flip the switch, power it back on, and you're done. Then the Tink 4K Pro can handle the deinterlacing and you're all set. But to be honest, in almost all scenarios, you could just leave it in 480p and it'll just work fine. So I'll leave a link to the Dreamcast page where you could pick up whichever one's closest for you that's in stock. But that is a perfectly reasonable option that allows for both. I wouldn't go down the route of a VGA box anymore or anything like that because you just don't need them. The SCART cables that are correctly and well built will just do all of that for you. So I'll leave a link to the Dreamcast page and go from there. Next up, Dumez is looking to get an adapter so that their Triad power supply will work on a Genesis 2. And while the adapters from the sites that I linked to are very cheap, shipping to a different country is extremely expensive, making it completely not worth the price at all. So in this scenario, what I would actually do is try to get the same exact adapter locally. And Firebrand X has a Triad page that has all of this stuff linked to it. So you should just be able to get eBay links or maybe even try to find the same thing on, depending on where you are in the world, on AliExpress or something like that, and just try to get the same exact part number. Especially when you start going eBay and AliExpress, you never really know what you're going to get. But if it seems to be the same brand and everything else, you should be fine. So I think the best way for anybody to go about doing this isn't to use a shipping forwarding service or anything like that. It would just be to try to find a different seller that sells the exact same thing. So I'll leave a link to FBX's page on that, and hopefully you'll be able to track down the exact adapter that you need. Well, that's it for this week. If you're new to these Q&As, ask any question that you would like wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post. The way the services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. But also, as you saw here today, I like to just jump between the services and scroll through answering questions as if we were just hanging out somewhere having a laid-back conversation. So anything you got, just ask them there. And of course, and as always, thank you to everybody who supports in absolutely any way, because it really is what's keeping all this stuff going. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.